much. Thanks so much for having me, inviting me, Carolina, and yeah, really pleased to be here to present my PhD research, which is on AI incidents and how it is we come to say no or to refuse AI systems. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, obviously had a bit of an intro there, so I'll quickly just give a background of who I am and how I do my kind of PhD work. I'm going to talk a bit about refusal, why I think this is an important kind of response to forms of governance, and the gap in the literature that I'm really trying to address with my PhD. I'm going to talk a bit about what AI incidents are. So if you saw the poster, you'll have seen the term AI incidents. That's what I'm kind of using as kind of empirical data to try and address the gap that I've identified. And I'm going to kind of talk through some examples of those incidents. I'm then going to kind of turn to the claims that I'm going to be making about refusal using these kind of case studies and in my empirical chapters in my PhD. And then there'll be time for Q&A. So to start with a bit about me, so as kind of Carolina gestured, I kind of work with a few different kind of methods to inquire and respond to harms from digital technologies. So I spend a lot of time working on mis and disinformation. I now focus a lot on AI harms and AI risks. So part of that is through research. So you can see one of my articles that I published, which kind of sets the scene for my PhD, the research agenda that I'm looking to kind of pursue. So I do that part-time, where it's around kind of 1.5 days a week. I also work for a policy think tank, so use some of my PhD research to make recommendations to the government about how they should regulate some of the most powerful systems. So here you can see one of my reports, which is about kind of tracking AI incidents and using that to inform how we regulate AI. And I also work developing technology, so worked for the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology to develop a kind of AI-based tech platform that was designed to spot disinformation online and help the government respond to it. So I kind of try and use lots of different kind of angles and different ways of approaching digital harms to try and work out how to address them. But yeah, today I'm going to be talking about my PhD, which brings me to refusal. So what is refusal? Well, refusal is saying no to something. And what's involved in that is the idea of a kind of more outright rejection of something, often based on the idea that it's better to say no completely than to engage or tweak or reform or try and ameliorate somehow the thing that you're concerned with. And why is this kind of important? Well, I thought I would draw on an example from online dating because it was Carolina that invited me here today. Dating apps are a really good example of how people are kind of explicitly engaging in a discourse of saying no, of saying that they don't want to use the apps anymore. There's a rising discourse of celibacy and of not wanting to engage in dating at all. And because there's an appreciation of some of the kind of pressures, the frustrations, some of the risks that are involved in using dating apps, and particularly for women. And you can see here the response that one dating app has had, Bumble, where they had a big advertising campaign saying, celibacy is not the answer, which I think points to the fact that this can be a very powerful form of resistance to forms of governance that we experience in our day-to-day lives. And it's a way that people in their kind of everyday use of digital apps are responding, both implicitly by trying not to use things, but also explicitly in the discourse around that being one of kind of celibacy and refusal. Now, I'm not looking at dating apps in particular, but what I am looking at is how refusal has arisen as a response to data governance. So what do we mean by data governance? Well, data is increasingly being used as an instrument to know and understand and judge and decide and take actions in the world. It's being used to represent ideas, identities, allocate resources, and there's a growing appreciation of the stakes that data-enabled governance is having for our everyday lives. And this is being intensified by artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is making it possible to kind of process boundless amounts of data, essentially infinite amounts of data. There's not actually enough data that they can get to feed into these algorithmic systems. And that's making it possible to use that data to act upon the world and intervene in ways that influence behavior. So refusal has arisen as a response to this. So data refusal is defined here by Zong and Matthias in a piece earlier this year as a practice of saying no to how data are collected and used, but also rejecting the processes and the goals and the authority of data collectors. So what this definition helps to pick out is we're talking about both the specific rejection of a kind of situated practice of data collection, but also the values and the logics and the principles that underpin that. So it's kind of doing both at the same time. And I think that this is becoming more and more of a strategy, and there's more and more interest in academic literature about how this works, what people are doing to do refusals. So there's been a lot of attention to things like this. So the activity of refusing. So here is a banner, it's probably fairly familiar, where you have the option to refuse non-essential cookies. So this is from Twitter, or X, formerly Twitter. And this is reflective of the requirements of GDPR, which is a piece of legislation that kind of builds into it the idea that you should have the ability to say no to certain forms of data tracking. So we can see how much this concept and this response of refusals embedded in the mainstream of our legal and technical infrastructure. This is very mundane. It's something we experience and we engage within as individuals. There are also collective acts. So IBM a few years ago was using images of people's faces without their consent to train facial recognition technologies. And there was a lawsuit that was raised in the United States through a kind of group of campaigners, and they successfully got IBM to stop doing this practice, and they've actually since stopped doing facial recognition at all. So these are really kind of effective and concrete ways that individuals and groups are pushing back against these systems. So this is really, really interesting work. And the question that I have and what I want to kind of bring to this field is what precedes the no. So there's a lot of focus on the acts and the decisions to refuse. How do people refuse? This has been the kind of central question that's been grappled with in the literature so far. But what I'm interested in is how people come to the position that they decide to say no. What are the processes that are involved in making us think that certain situated data systems and AI systems are worthy of refusal or demand refusal or suggest refusal as a response? And as part of that, what are the conditions that lead us to come to that position and come to that orientation towards an AI system? Now, this is where I think the science and technology studies, which is the field that I work in, can help to provide some answers. So researchers in science and technology studies have long been interested in how technoscientific objects become problematized in ways that spark collectives to form, often through things like controversies, public controversies, to form and then act upon those systems. So how do systems like AI models become problematized? One of the ways that SES has understood this is through processes of what's called articulation. So you are engaging in both a discursive act of framing the way that we understand a technology. But articulation is also, if you think about something like an articulated lorry, it's about two things kind of being connected together, and often in material ways. So groups coming together, relationships to not just other people and other collectives, but other material entities. And part of what science and technology studies brings to this is a kind of accordance to things and material entities, the ability to inspire us or to provoke us or to change the way we think or we do or we act in some kind of way. So it's both a discursive process of articulation and also a material reconfiguration of how we interact and relate to the material actors around us. So I think science and technologies is well placed to try and address this question and provides us with a lot of the conceptual tools that we can kind of approach it. And one of these, a couple of concepts that I want to introduce here, drawing on science and technology studies' kind of existing conceptual toolkit, and these are kind of my theoretical contributions in this PhD, is first the idea of refusability. So what I want to describe with refusability is the idea that is a certain kind of problematization of an AI system where refusal is proposed or suggested as a response. And I think key to this are two claims. So one is that that AI system is harmful in some way and needs some kind of response on the basis of those harms. But there's a second part of this, which is a claim that it can't or shouldn't be reformed. And this is key to the refusal literature. It's the basis upon which we say, rather than trying to engage with something like AI, even with certain practices that we might see as very positive, such as feminist data science or AI ethics, which we have come to understand as ways of improving outcomes from AI, it involves a way of saying, actually, that is not the right approach. And often this is to do with an appreciation that AI is intrinsically unreformable. And often there are kind of two arguments that are made here. So the first is that AI is based on using data from unjust pasts to determine individual and collective futures. And it's the unjust pasts, the pasts that are recorded on the internet, the toxic past, the overrepresentation of certain identities over other, all of the basis from where inequities of AI come from are being used and preserved and used to make decisions about the future. And progressive politics is based on an attempt to move beyond where we've come from and not to conserve some of those kind of older prejudices, injustices. So how can you reform that if that is the very architecture of the model? So that's one claim. There's a second claim, which is around the fact that AI is premised on surveillance. So in order for AI to work, you have to collect data, you have to monitor people, and you have to intensify this more and more and more. And there is no way to kind of reform that practice. So these are the kinds of claims that circulate around the refusal of AI. And it's based on both this kind of idea of harm, but also unreformability. And this constitutes what I'm calling refusability. So it's how you kind of problematize AI as refusable. Now, the second concept that I draw on here is the idea of a matter of refusal. So in science and technology studies, there is an idea about, rather than thinking of matters of a fact, thinking of matters of concern. So how is it the matter, physical entity, comes to matter in social and political ways? How does it form attachments to us that mean that we orientate around it, interact with it, act in certain ways? And there's an idea that there are kind of social processes that gather associations and attachments that kind of coalesce these kind of objects like AI into something that we have certain relationships to. Now, this idea of matters of concern, I'm adapting here into the idea of a matter of refusal. So how is it that we come to build associations and orientations that we come to refuse an AI system? So these are the two kind of conceptual contributions that I'm making through my assessment and the kind of fusing of the refusal literature with ideas in science and technology studies. So the question here is, well, okay, we've got some questions emerging, but what empirical data can we use to try and address this gap? How can we understand what comes before the no, how this process of articulation of these claims, how the gathering of a matter of refusal happens? And this is where I'm saying AI incidents come in. So I'm sure many of you are very familiar with examples of AI incidents. You might even have seen one yourself. You might have experienced an interaction with an AI system. You might have seen a news report. You might have seen all sorts of things that have cultivated a kind of incident around AI. Now, I'm going to go through some of the theoretical work around AI incidents, and then I'm going to move into some examples and show you what I'm kind of talking about here. So firstly, what do I mean by an AI incident? So an AI incident is an example of AI going wrong. And it goes wrong in a way that captures attention, outrage, to such a significant extent that a response is demanded from a technology company. And often that response is the removal of that AI system. So just practically, this presents quite a useful set of case studies because they're examples of practically saying no to an AI system, a collective forming, organizing around an AI system, saying no, and then that affecting the change that is being sought. And there are thousands of these examples that have arisen over the last 10 years, and I think this is a really kind of underutilized source of empirical data about AI-mediated societies that have yet to be kind of fully leveraged for sociological work. So by kind of engaging with this idea around AI incidents, I'm kind of contributing to quite a small but growing field that pays attention to kind of troubles and frictions and the way that we interact with AI on a daily basis. So there's a concept here called algorithm trouble, which was developed by a few of my colleagues and Jonathan Gray, who's my PhD supervisor. And they use the word trouble to designate a problem and a state of confusion and distress. We see algorithm troubles as failures, computer errors, bugs, but also unsettling events that may elicit or even provoke other perspectives on what it means to live with algorithms. So there's an idea entailed here that our everyday, quite intimate, maybe even quite private interactions with algorithms are generative of new ways of thinking about how we should and should not be living with them. And this starts to point towards why these episodes can be really helpful for thinking about how refusal emerges, especially on online spaces. And the word trouble is helpful because it kind of gestures towards how you might like troubleshoot a piece of technology. You have troubles in technology as a kind of like term of art that's used to explain technical breakdowns. But it also gestures towards being troubled and how what it feels like and the kind of effective response of seeing something unsettling that an algorithm does. Now, I'm also interested, and one of the kind of contributions I want to make to this kind of emerging interest in STS in these moments and frictions, I'm interested in integrating a bit more the work of Sara Ahmed, who has really interestingly been very focused on ideas of trouble, but also troublemaking, and has done a lot of work on refusal. So I think there's some kind of really fertile ground to explore here. And I think one of the really distinctive contributions of Sara Ahmed is this idea of the troublemaker. So trouble isn't just something that passively happens to you. Trouble is something that also can be provoked, and it's something that can involve processes of disrupting and unsettling social situations in ways that upset others and disturb others, but in doing so expose instances of racism and sexism in particular. So she talks about the act of describing and naming, making it possible to communicate these things to others. And often she'll talk about things like pointing out that a joke is sexist in a social situation, and it causes a kind of frisson of feeling and of discomfort that orientates the group around an instance of sexism. And I think that this kind of phenomenological approach to thinking about trouble can help us think through what is going on in these incidents. Like, how are people orientating around instances of harm in ways that are sometimes provoked in intentional ways and contain episodes of political action. So these are the kind of conceptual frameworks I'm looking to draw on to kind of come to these incidents. And I'm going to talk through 3 incidents now with you. So I go through quite a few in my PhD research. I'm just going to go through 3 so I don't kind of bore you too much with examples. So, and I should say as well, before I move on, there are examples and instances of racism and sexism in some of the content that I'm about to show you. So I just want you to kind of be aware of that, and you're kind of welcome to not take a look. One example I have here is quite an old one from 2015, and this is one that unfolded in response to Flickr, the image sharing website, labeling all of its photos with automated tags. So trying to describe the contents of a photo with a tag. And this caused a huge amount of upset at the time. And eventually one of the things that was discovered was some really offensive tags that were applied. So here's an example of a concentration camp being described as a jungle gym or as sport, and kind of trivializing the Holocaust. And this was reported on by The Guardian at the time, and resulted in Flickr having to remove the tool from being a kind of compulsory part of the platform. We have an example here from 2016, although this has unfolded across many, many years, of Google Translate being exposed as reproducing sexist stereotypes. So what you can see here is a gender-neutral language in Estonian, which refers to certain professions without gendering them. And then the translation into English, where you have to use gendered pronouns, assigns the pronouns to those professions in terms of sexist stereotypes. So she is beautiful, she's nice, he's smart, he's strong, he is the president, he's a doctor, she is a cleaner, she is a hairdresser, she is a teacher, he is an engineer, he decides. And in a similar fashion, this was reported on by the news. Google was forced into having some kind of response. They tried and they failed to fix this problem, and this is an example of the ways in which the unreformability of these models gets exposed, the fact that Google just can't fix this. And I'll close the kind of examples I'm going to show with this one. So this is an example of an image cropping algorithm being exposed as racist. So essentially the way that this works is that on Twitter, if you have a very long photo, you have to crop because you can't show the whole thing on the platform. So the question for Twitter is, where do you crop? Where in an image do you crop? And they used an algorithm to identify which section of an image to crop on. And what you can see here, as kind of visualizes the way that this tweet works as a kind of test, is that in both cases, despite no matter where the image is, it crops on the face of Senator Mitch McConnell, who is white, and crops out the face of Barack Obama. And this was kind of used to expose a bias that eventually Twitter acknowledged, and then they removed this algorithm from production. And so again, this is an example of a collective, and this was one of many, many tweets about this, organizing online to push back against an AI system and doing that very effectively. So I'm now in a position to kind of like properly articulate the research question that I'm looking to kind of answer in my PhD research. So this question is, how were AI systems articulated as refusable during AI incidents between 2015 and 2025? I know it's not 2025 yet, but it's going to be the span of my PhD, and it's neater to have 10 years, I think. And what does this say about the conditions of possibility for refusal? So what I'm asking here is, like, how did this process unfold? How did this articulation happen? And more importantly, like, what does this tell us about how refusal can or cannot emerge in AI-mediated societies? So what are my claims about this? My kind of fundamental claim is that AI is refused through forms of connective action, which is the idea of people kind of coming together in online spaces in particular ways, but that it involves a set of non-human actors. So there's a dependency on things like formats for people to come together in ways that kind of structure interactions. There's a dependence on the behavior of the AI systems themselves, and there's a dependence on the digital platforms in which this occurs. So my kind of primary claim is a simple one, which is that refusal involves not just human intent, and that human intent doesn't arrive from nowhere. It arrives through processes that involve not just humans, but a whole wider set of infrastructures and technologies and environments. And I think that this has some kind of significant implications for how we understand how refusal isn't able to emerge. So I'm going to talk through my 3 chapters. So in each of my chapters, I focus on one non-human actor that I think is salient for understanding how the process of articulation unfolds. And I'll go through these one by one, and then we'll almost be at the end. So the first is that formats are really important. So what formats do is they provide a kind of script for interacting with a ubiquitous AI system that others can replicate and adapt and spread online. So I'm going to use this example of the one that you saw earlier, the Google Translate bias. So this tweet in 2016 kind of represents the first example of this being shown. This is in an online space. So this is a conference where there's a slide where this was kind of shown. And what you can see is a really simple version of this. Ober doctor, which is O is a gender-neutral pronoun in Turkish, turns into he is a doctor. Ober hemşire turns into she is a nurse. I probably pronounced that wrong, so I ask for forgiveness for any Turkish people in the room. Now, what this does is it creates a format. It basically says you can also interact with this system in this way, and you will get similar results. And what we see is a few hours later, so this is the same day, this is actually what someone's done. So someone's taken this format and they've adapted it. So now they're using Finnish, and they're finding exactly the same result. And so what this format does is it allows people to connect asynchronously across different spaces and different times to point out examples of sexism, in a way that kind of Sarah Ahmed was thinking in, around the dinner table or in a social situation of pointing out instances of sexism. We're seeing this kind of translating into a kind of digital medium where people are working together in disparate ways to point out these examples. And it's structured through formats. And these formats become really important in order for this to happen. And I think this kind of phrase, ouch, same, is really kind of good at grasping what's going on here. Because there's this idea of like, ouch, this like hurts. There's something painful. There's like an injustice going on here. There's something troubling. And there's this idea of same, which is a kind of, wraps within it the idea of experimental replication. So replicating the results of a study or of an experiment. I've got the same results. And also a kind of, a sameness and identification. I'm also experiencing this and identifying as part of like an emerging, perhaps effervescent and temporary, but an emerging online collective. And these spread, and this happened over years. So this started in 2016, and people are still doing this now, like still replicating this now because they've seen examples. So what I'm kind of saying with this is the formats are really important and easily neglected if we're just focusing on people and their intentions and their decisions. The second kind of claim that I'm making is that AI systems themselves play a very important role in their own refusal. They actually engage in refusals of users. So it's like a really important part of contemporary AI systems. There's an economic imperative for AI models like ChatGPT to refuse some user requests because they're illegal, because they're offensive, and ironically, because they can cause trouble for technology companies. So there's a kind of reciprocity of the way that people have behaved in relation to AI systems that have changed the design of those AI systems that are now prompting further AI incidents. So this is kind of where it starts to help to kind of distinguish. This was purely a kind of discursive process. This is a material reconfiguration of the AI systems and responses in response, a kind of reciprocity. So we have an example here. There's a tool in 2022 that was launched by Meta. This was designed to kind of produce scientific papers. And what people realized was that it would refuse certain requests of like completely, like very important and well-established academic fields. So like queer theory, critical race theory, anything to do with racism, anything to do with AIDS. So what's being refused is the refusal. People are refusing their own refusal by the AI system. And I think this is important because it kind of shows how AI systems participate by provoking and inspiring certain intentions and orientations. This is not a case of a kind of liberal, rational actor, independent of all kind of infrastructural support. This is people who are very much imbricated in the behaviors of these AI systems, and they kind of can't really be separated. There was another example here in 2024 of Google launching a tool called Gemini, and it produced what it was attempting to be kind of diverse images of history. It's resulted in all kinds of like strange creations, like images of people of color who were Nazis, and an inability to kind of get a diverse representation of people that people were comfortable with. Now, this was kind of co-opted as a kind of way of problematizing the AI system as kind of woke and as kind of engaging kind of white erasure. But it shows how much the AI tool and the way it's designed, and this is kind of to do with an infrastructural layer called reinforcement learning with human feedback, which is essentially where the AI system learns what's wrong and what people think is bad, and then tries to adjust its responses, and then is resulting in these further incidents occurring. So here I'm trying to kind of gesture towards AI systems as kind of playing a really important role. And finally, I want to talk about the kind of digital platforms as well. So what I'm kind of finding is that people want to refuse AI systems for all sorts of reasons. People often want to refuse AI systems because they don't give them consent, or because they breach their privacy. But the tendency and the pressure on refusers is to kind of focus in on the most extreme and offensive examples of AI harms in order to problematize it in a way that gets news coverage. So I look at this example on Flickr, which I gestured to earlier. This kind of unfolded on a very old internet forum. And then I look at the cropping algorithm one, which unfolded on a kind of much more modern and dynamic social media platform of Twitter. And in both cases, it was ignored, and there was a kind of pressure on people to find these examples that were the most egregious and the most kind of unacceptable. And this is kind of like an interesting process because it suggests that there's a kind of elective affinity almost between the pressure for attention and the exposure of acts of kind of racism and sexism. But I think that it also raises some kind of more worrying questions, such as things don't continue to be shocking. You lose novelty, and it raises questions about whether these are going to continue to shock. Will examples of racism continue to shock in ways that actually prompt responses from technology companies? And I think these dynamics of the attention economy are placing a kind of like having an important influence on how things can and cannot come to be refused. So they're my kind of 3 empirical chapters. Just to recap. So I'm kind of arguing that formats, AI systems, and digital platforms play a significant role in how AI is articulated and refusable. And this is not just kind of humans having equipment to do what they want to do. So like I've got an opt-out button that I can click. It's about those actors kind of prompting and nurturing the very intention to refuse, and playing a much more kind of fundamental role in this process of what kind of comes before the no. Okay, so what? Does this matter? Why does this matter? Well, I have not written my conclusion yet, so TBC. But the thing that I'm really interested in is what are the stakes then of these material infrastructures if we're so dependent on them for challenging forms of governance? And I'm kind of really interested in this quote from Judith Butler, and she says, "No one moves without a supportive environment and a set of technologies. And when those environments start to fall apart or are emphatically unsupportive, we're left to fall in some ways, and our very capacity to exercise most basic rights is imperiled." So a lot of my PhD is looking at Twitter, and obviously one of the backdrops for this is that Twitter is potentially imperiled and is deteriorating, and is being designed with this certain kind of political interests. And it's interesting that the most recent example of an AI system going wrong was where these kind of tactics were co-opted by the far right, and kind of on the basis of kind of white nationalism in the States. And I think this kind of points towards, if we care about refusal and the ability to refuse, maybe opt-out buttons and things of that nature are part of that picture, but there is a wider set of environments and technologies that we need to cultivate these responses and interactions and provocations that are in jeopardy, I think, with the fragmentation of the internet and with the deterioration of a platform like Twitter. Now, this is not to kind of position Twitter as this amazing place. It's a kind of corporate ad-based platform. But I think it does raise the kind of question of, what does spaces for troublings and spaces for refusal, what do they look like? How can we design environments where we're able to kind of learn and provoke and probe and kind of act and speak together? And how is that being kind of jeopardized in the direction that we're heading with social media at the moment? So that's it. Thank you so much. Thanks so much. Really appreciate your attention. Hopefully it was a good time.